So now that we've reviewed the bigger picture and what the FBA process could look like, let's talk more about the different FBA methods. So as I mentioned previously, we have the 3 different types of FBA methods. We have our indirect functional assessment, which are those interviews, checklists, rating skills, questionnaires, where we're just getting information from the different stakeholders on the behavior and the environmental variables that might contribute to the behavior. And then we have our descriptive functional assessments, which is where we are observing the behavior and we're collecting data on the behavior. And then finally, we have our functional analysis, which is where we are experimentally manipulating that behavior. And if you notice, these 3 assessments are inside of a pyramid, and it's not for no reason. The reason that they're inside of a pyramid is because these assessments, the further down we go, the less consistent or reliable the results are. The further up we go, the more confident we can be in our results. We have better prediction, better control, and confidence in our results. So the functional analysis is going to provide us with the best results, the best prediction, the best control, and the best confidence in our results. And then the higher up we go, the more specialized or the more specialized each of these assessments are, and then the more training is required to engage in these particular assessments. The indirect assessments are relatively easy to conduct. You're typically following a checklist or you're completing a questionnaire. Pretty much anyone can do these as long as they've received training, once or twice on them. Then the descriptive functional assessment requires a little bit more skill. You have to be able to observe the behavior, collect good quality ABC data, and then analyze those results to come up with a hypothesis. But the functional analysis is one that requires a lot more training, and you have to conduct your sessions in a very particular way, and it's very systematic. And then again, the further up we go through the pyramid, the more time and effort it takes to complete each of these. So an interview you can get done in a very relatively short amount of time. Whereas the observations, you might have to go to the client's school, to the client's home setting, or to their workplace, across multiple days to be able to complete your analysis. And then the functional analysis will definitely be something that you could conduct across multiple days, depending on. It depends. There's different types of functional analyses. There's been a lot of research in recent years to try to cut down on the time required to conduct functional analyses, but still it is something that takes more training, requires more training and effort to conduct. And you typically need more staff support also. Let's continue our discussion on the different types of assessments or assessment methods that can be included within an FBA. I gave you guys a general picture of what the FBA process looks like. And now we're just going to dive a little bit deeper into each of the assessment types and their strengths and limitations. And then we'll also go over the FAs in more detail. So the indirect assessments, as I mentioned, are those assessments in which we are just gathering information from, the client themselves, caregivers, people that are closely in close proximity or contact to the client. So it could be a teacher, a nanny, maybe their grandparents, people in the relevant settings that you're planning on servicing that client or where the client has specific needs. The indirect assessment is going to give us information about what context the behavior occurs within, so you can get information about what setting the behavior occurs in, with who the behavior might occur most frequently, etc. So it's, like I mentioned previously, out of all of the different assessments that we can conduct, it's the easiest to conduct. It's the most efficient, so it requires the least amount of resources, the least amount of time to be able to administer. And it gives us a pretty broad perspective as to, what that person's needs may be across different settings. Now, the descriptive assessments are assessments that, like I mentioned, require a little bit more resources and more time as well. And we have to use our indirect assessments to guide our descriptive assessments. The descriptive assessments are going to require us to observe the individual and the context within which the behavior occurs. We want to collect data on the different environmental variables that are occurring before and after the behavior. And this is going to give us very detailed information on the antecedents and consequences. And then we'll be able to, throughout the descriptive assessments, we'll be able to generate hypotheses on the functions of the problem behavior. So it helps us to narrow down potential functions for the behavior. Sometimes when you have a very, very clear functions of problem behavior, the descriptive assessment is enough. You'll conduct a descriptive assessment and the behavior consistently occurs with the same antecedents and with the same consequence following the behavior. And so it's very easy to identify the function of the behavior. This isn't always the case. And so sometimes we do need to conduct, further analysis to determine what the function is. But there are times where the descriptive assessment is you gain very clear results from them. So these are some of the strengths of each of these different assessments. And then, of course, nothing is without limitations. So we're going to review the different limitations of each of these as well. So the most prominent, I would say, limitation for the indirect assessments is that it's a subjective assessment. The indirect assessments are based off of, a caregiver, the client, or other stakeholders just giving you their opinion or their perspective on what they see, what they've observed, what they believe. And it comes with sometimes, some biases. And so because you're basing the assessment on just, caregiver report or client report, there can be, like I said, some biases or they might be inaccurate. We as behavior analysts often know what we're looking for, but caregivers aren't, trained in behavior analysis. And so they don't necessarily look at things in the same way that we look at environmental variables or analyze things in the same way. And so often during the indirect assessments, we're having to guide them or ask, you have to, as an assessor, make sure that you're asking really good quality questions to get the information that you're looking for. If not, then sometimes you don't get really high quality information from a indirect assessment because the caregiver themselves may not entirely know how to analyze the situation in the way that we would analyze it as a behavior analyst. We might be getting some responses, with some mentalistic responses from them, or they might be referring to mood. And so it's our job to decipher or break down what they mean, ask questions that will help them rephrase in a different way or that will help us get more context from them. So, of course, the indirect assessments can give us some information, some useful information, but we as behavior analysts have to be able to break apart the information that's not so useful. And that's okay, because this is an opportunity for you to build rapport with caregivers and for you to get to know them and their needs. So it's okay that not all of the information is going to be perfect at guiding you with your intervention. It's also a way for you to build rapport with them. So like I mentioned, some of the results might be inconsistent across different raters because people have different perspectives. So you might ask mom something and then ask dad the same exact question, and they might have different experiences or different opinions. And so, like I said, it's up to you to maybe decipher what the information is that you're getting from the different caregivers, ask questions that could help you get a clearer response from them or a clearer picture of what could be going on. And then sometimes you might not get a clear picture from the indirect assessment, and that's okay. You're going to have to rely on your descriptive assessments and your experimental analyses to really know the function of the behavior. So descriptive assessments also have their own limitations in that descriptive assessments, we are just observing what's going on in the environment and we're not necessarily manipulating anything. So the descriptive assessment, like I said, can give us sometimes a very clear picture of what the function of the problem behavior is, but oftentimes that's not the case. So a descriptive assessment is always going to give us a correlation, but it's not going to give us a causation. We're simply observing what's going on with the behavior and the environmental variables that are surrounding the behavior, but we're not manipulating anything, so we can only make assumptions about how one variable correlates with another with the behavior. So we cannot say that there's like a a clear functional relationship or a clear function from the descriptive assessments, we can make a pretty solid hypothesis. In some cases, is what I have been trying to explain in the last few minutes, is that sometimes it gives us a very clear hypothesis, but it's not until we do the experimental analysis or the functional analysis that we know, with a pretty high degree of certainty, this is the function of the behavior. But what I was trying to say was that sometimes we can have a really strong hypothesis, and some behavior analysts will opt not to do a functional analysis because the function seems pretty clear from the descriptive assessment. But really the best practice is to conduct our functional analysis, which is where we are manipulating those different variables. So some of the other limitations from the descriptive assessment is that it could give us misleading results, meaning that some common consequences like attention may appear to reinforce the behavior even if they don't. And then lack of experimental control, which is that we cannot differentiate between multiple potential maintaining variables. And of course, there's lack of experimental control because we're not manipulating anything. There's no experiment going on. We're not manipulating any particular variables to see the effect on the behavior. In this case, we're simply observing what is going on in the environment and collecting data to conduct an analysis of that data, but we are not manipulating anything. So of course, there's a lack of experimental control with descriptive assessments. What this means is that while our indirect and descriptive assessments are going to provide very valuable information, they will often lack that precision to confirm a causal relationship between environmental variables and the problem behavior. So this is where functional analyses do become essential. So functional analyses or FAs or experimental analyses, you'll hear different terms to relate to this same particular assessment type. You'll hear FAs, you'll hear functional analyses or experimental analyses. They're all the same thing. They're referring to a systematic and empirical analysis of behavior and environmental relations. We're basically putting clients through a systematic manipulation of antecedent and consequent events to observe their effect on the behavior. The aim or the purpose of a functional analysis is always to identify those different variables that are maintaining behavior. We want to know which consequences are controlling our behavior, which consequences are reinforcing the behavior. By discovering these cause and effect relationships, we're able to then come up with function-based interventions. That's what I've mentioned is the entire purpose of conducting a functional behavior assessment is to identify function and be able to come up with an intervention based on that function so that we can more effectively reduce the behavior. So how exactly is a functional analysis conducted? Well, within a functional analysis, what we basically do is we expose our clients to different controlled conditions. Functional analyses are conducted in a very contrived environment. Usually, there's different types of functional analyses and different variations, and some of the newer variations you can conduct in a more natural setting. But even those that you conduct in a more natural setting, they're still very controlled in that we are exposing our clients to a very particular condition. We are controlling the antecedent variables that we're exposing the clients to. And then we are, trying to see if we can evoke the behavior. And then if the behavior occurs, we expose them to a very particular consequence. And what we want to see is essentially, is this consequence that I'm delivering going to be enough to maintain the behavior in that particular condition? And I'll give you guys examples of what that looks like. But basically, the conditions that produce the most behavior or in which the behavior occurs the quickest, those are the conditions in which those are the controlling conditions basically for the behavior. We can hypothesize that that is the function of the behavior. So I'll go into further detail on what that looks like. So anytime that I talk about a functional analysis, I like to give an example of an allergy test because I think that functional analyses are very similar to allergy tests in that an allergy test is a controlled experiment that you're conducting where you're exposing a person to different drops of allergens. And then you're testing to see the reaction that causes in the person. And the way that you can identify if a person is allergic to something or not is by looking at the reaction that's produced. And we're doing the exact same thing in a functional analysis. Okay, so as an example, in case some of you are not familiar with what an allergy test is, within an allergy test, there could be different quadrants. Okay, the person's skin is numbered with, like, it's very difficult to see on this slide, but it would say like number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. There could be even more that you test, okay? And what happens is each one of these little squares, the patient or the doctor places a drop of an allergen on that patient's skin, on that little patch of skin. Okay, so for example, they could place a drop of pollen here. They can place a drop of mold here. They can place a drop of, dust mites here. They can place a drop of peanuts here, eggs on this one, milk, etc., and so on and so forth. And then the doctor will have their list for what each of these numbers is associated with. And they'll be able to see, okay, the one for pollen didn't produce a reaction, but the one for mold. The one for mold produced a very strong reaction. So we can confidently say this person is allergic to mold. Okay. We're going to do something really similar in functional analyses, where we are going to expose a person to a condition really similar to how this is set up. Okay, we're not doing it on their arm, of course. It's not a visual test like this, but we're going to expose a person to different conditions to see what their reaction is to that condition. And the condition that produces the highest rate of behavior or under rate, and like I mentioned, there are different types of functional analyses, and some functional analyses we look at the frequency of the behavior, and then in other ones it's a little bit too dangerous to have a person engage in a behavior often, and so we just look at which one produces the behavior the quickest. But the general idea is the condition within which the reaction is produced most often or the quickest, that's the condition that's maintaining the behavior. Okay, that's the function of the behavior. So let's look at that a little bit more. So what is the reason that we conduct FAs? Like I mentioned, it's to identify those cause and effect relationships, to really confidently say this is the variable that's maintaining the problem behavior. And also I don't think I've mentioned this before, but FAs are the gold standard in behavior analysis. And that sounds like an exaggeration. It really is not. FAs are the best quality method and the most proven method that we have in our field to identify functions of problem behavior. And that's why I've been trying to say throughout this presentation that we should always conduct functional analyses. But for different reasons, functional analyses are not always conducted. One of those being that sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, our descriptive assessments give pretty decent results. And so people will opt not to continue into the FA section. But really the best practice would be to conduct an FA. There are many different reasons why people don't conduct FAs, and we'll talk about those briefly, but that's a much longer conversation that you'll probably have in another course or in grad school. So FAs are great because they eliminate guesswork and they can ensure that interventions address the actual maintaining variables. And then a key takeaway is that by identifying the controlling contingencies, FAs allow behavior analysts to develop interventions that are more likely to succeed and lead to socially significant behavior change. I want you guys to think about something. When we don't know clearly what the function of a behavior is, you still have to intervene as a behavior analyst, right? We still have, our job is to identify behaviors to work on, hopefully identify the function of the behavior and then intervene on that behavior. If we don't have a clear function of behavior, the behavior analyst is still going to intervene, but it's less likely that that intervention is going to be effective, okay? And it's less likely that we'll be able to identify, it might be effective. We don't know for sure, but it's going to be more of a trial and error basis. And so what we're trying to do when we conduct FAs is to be able to narrow down which interventions are likely to be effective, and kind of eliminate that guesswork. We're saving resources this way. We're taking less time, etc. It really just ends up benefiting the client more. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of functional analyses. So functional analyses were originally developed by Brian Iwata in 1982. And he developed what we typically call the traditional FA, but as I mentioned, there are many variations of the traditional FA. And it really created, like I mentioned, the first experimental way to test for the function of behavior. It's the gold standard. It's what we should be conducting as behavior analysts, and it's really the best way that we have to identify functions of problem behavior. There are two types of conditions that we typically will expose clients to when we are conducting a functional analysis. The first are the test conditions, and the test conditions are meant to simulate potential environmental variables that are going to be maintaining the behavior. So if we hypothesize that a behavior could be maintained by attention, well, then we'll create a specific condition where we'll set up an EO, an establishing operation for attention, right? We want the person we want to basically mimic the environment that the behavior engages in. That the client engages in the behavior. So if a client naturally in their environment does not receive a lot of high quality attention, and that's why they engage in problem behavior, well, we want to set up a very similar condition during the functional analysis to see if really attention is the maintaining variable for that behavior. Similarly, we want to see if escape is maintaining the behavior. So we try to present that establishing operation by providing similar work that might evoke the behavior. And then we provide escape to see if escape is the one maintaining the function, maintaining that behavior. And then we also have control conditions. And our control conditions, we set them up differently depending on the type of functional analysis that we're conducting. But the control condition, the purpose is the same across all functional analyses. It serves as a baseline to compare the behavior across the test conditions and the control conditions. We're basically trying to say, in a control condition, we try to account for all the different types of needs that a client may have. So in a control condition, we typically will try to satisfy the EO or satiate the EO. So for example, we want to make sure that if we're concerned about attention, let's say that we're concerned that a behavior may be maintained by attention, well, in a control condition for attention, we'll provide attention non-contingently, or we'll provide attention very frequently so that that person doesn't have a reason to engage in the behavior if it is for attention. Okay, so in a controlled condition, we basically want to see if we want to satisfy the need for that behavior. This will become clear. If it's unclear right now in the way that I'm explaining it, it'll become clear in another slide that I have on a control condition. So these are some of the different variations of functional analyses. As I mentioned, there are many variations, and I'll briefly cover some of them. The traditional functional analysis is set up to have different test conditions that each last about 10 minutes. And so we'll have an attention condition for 10 minutes, a tangible condition for 10 minutes. We'll have an escape condition or a demand condition, and we have the play and the alone condition. And you don't know what those conditions are just yet, but the idea is they're set up in different ways. So the traditional functional analysis is set up so that each condition lasts about 10 minutes. Then we repeat those conditions over and over and over and over multiple times. Whereas a brief functional analysis, we're exposing the person to the condition one time for a much shorter period of time. The latency functional analysis is a functional analysis that we use for behaviors that are more dangerous. Because as you can imagine, there are behaviors where it's not a good idea to have the person engage in that behavior multiple times over and over and over for 10 minutes. That could be dangerous, of course. And so for the latency functional analysis, what we do is we expose the person to the condition, and they only need to engage in the behavior one time. Once they engage in the behavior one time, then we stop the session and we move on. And what we track is basically how long did it take from the moment the session started to the moment the person engaged in the behavior. And we look at, instead of how often the behavior occurred, we look at the sessions in which the behavior occurred the quickest. And you don't have to know, for this course, you don't have to know the details on each variation of the functional analysis, but I'm mentioning them because it's good for you to know. You might have questions about, well, why are we exposing clients to engaging in problem behavior? Isn't the problem behavior a concern? Why would we want them to engage in it more? Well, that is a valid concern, and really the reason is that people engage in problem behavior anyways. Whether you're exposing them to, our clients, they engage in problem behavior anyway, whether we're exposing them to functional analyses or not. They're going to engage in the behavior because it's being reinforced in the natural environment. Within a functional analysis, what we're doing is we're doing the same thing that's occurring in the natural environment. We're just doing our best to identify the function so that we can reduce the behavior. The risk of a functional analysis and the risk of the behavior occurring in the natural environment is exactly the same. But of course, it can be different if the person engages in a severe form of behavior like property destruction or self-injury. We don't want a person to be engaging in that behavior with that very high frequency just so we can identify the function. So my point in mentioning all of these different functional analyses is so you can see that we have variations of them that account for these concerns. So the latency FA can be completed pretty quickly, and it's usually for those more severe behaviors. A trial-based FA is a type of functional analysis that is conducted in the natural environment and is set up in a similar way to the latency FA. It's just different in that the setup is different, but it's like a combination of the latency FA and the traditional FA, I would say, and it occurs in the natural environment. We have single function tests, which is when we really hypothesize that there's one maintaining variable and we have a pretty high degree of confidence, and we can just test that particular function. We don't have to do a full functional analysis. A precursor FA is a type of functional analysis. You guys don't know yet what a precursor is. You may know if you are already in the field practicing, but many of you might not know what a precursor is. A precursor is something that a person engages in prior to a problem behavior. And not all problem behaviors have a precursor, but it's basically like a signal that person gives that they're about to engage in problem behavior, in a very severe form of problem behavior usually. So as an example, if a person is going to engage in property destruction, right before they engage in property destruction, they might modify their face. Like they might, furrow their eyebrows down. They might whine a little bit, like and whine, and then if the condition remains the same, then they will likely engage in property destruction. So that is a precursor. Those little indications that people give prior to engaging in a more severe form of problem behavior is considered a precursor. And with a precursor FA, what we do is, instead of waiting for the severe form of problem behavior to occur, we reinforce that minor topography of the behavior, right? That precursor, before they engage in that severe problem behavior. Instead of waiting for them to engage in the severe problem behavior and then reinforce that, we instead just reinforce the little behaviors that they engage in before. And this is like a safety measure so that people aren't having to engage in severe forms of problem behavior in order for us to identify the function of a behavior. And then there's the ISCA, which is I don't know exactly what it stands for, but if you look up ISCA, you'll be able to find the functional analysis if you're interested. And it's a synthesized assessment in which we're combining multiple conditions that we think may be maintaining the behavior, and we test those multiple conditions together rather than separately. Okay. You'll learn more about functional analysis if you go to grad school, but I will talk about for the traditional functional analysis, what each of the different conditions can look like, and I'll show you what that may look like as well. So I'm going to do a little overview of the traditional functional analysis. So as I mentioned, each condition typically lasts for 10 minutes. And what we're doing is we are exposing the individuals to a specific antecedent in the hopes to be able to evoke a problem behavior if that's the, antecedent that typically precedes problem behavior. And then we will contingent on the problem behavior, we will deliver the consequence that's associated with that condition to see if that to see the condition basically that produces the highest amount of problem behavior, or in which the behavior occurs the quickest. Well, actually, within the traditional FA, we look at how often the behavior occurs. I'm sorry. So what is measured? We measure the frequency of the behavior, and sometimes we measure the duration of the behavior or the intensity of the behavior as well. But typically it's the frequency. We want to see how often within that 10-minute session did the behavior occur. And then we analyze that data one way that we analyze data in behavior analysis is visually. That's really the way that we look at our graphs, is we just look at the data visually to see whether there's a separation in the data, and then that's where we can see if there's like a functional relationship between the behavior and the condition that's presented. So we are going to be looking for patterns across different conditions, which are going to indicate the controlling contingency. I know that I'm being very vague when I say that we analyze data visually. The problem is that there's a lot that goes into data analysis and visual analysis, and you guys will have an entire course dedicated to that. And I'm going to expose you to a small part of it today, but you don't need to be exposed to everything about visual analysis just yet. As I mentioned, there's going to be an entire course. There's a lot that goes into it. So hopefully what we cover today will be enough to get you to understand how to analyze functional analysis data, because that's really what you need to prioritize for right now. Okay, so interpreting FA results. Like I mentioned, there's going to be different patterns that you should be observing across different conditions, and that will indicate the controlling contingency. There might be multiple controlling contingencies that will influence behavior. Usually we're looking for one, but it really depends on each behavior. Sometimes there are behaviors that occur for that have different functions. So it might occur for to gain attention from an adult, and it could also occur to get escape from a demand, right? So we have to look out to see if there are multiple functions of the behavior or if there is one function of the behavior. Okay, so I have some questions for you. This one is a true or false question. Behavior can have multiple functions. Okay, so the answer to this is true. That is correct. As I just mentioned, behavior can have multiple functions. We can have behavior that's maintained by escape and attention, or we can have behavior that's maintained by attention and access to tangibles, etc. So let's look at what the attention condition would look like. Remember I mentioned the traditional FA is typically 10 minutes long, but there can be variations to the duration. So with the attention condition, we are going to test that the behavior is maintained by attention, and the way that we do this is by setting up the environment in a particular way where the individual has access to some moderately preferred item, but they're not receiving any attention at all. Okay, so they're placed in a room with no distractions or minimal distractions, and then they're given access to a neutral or a moderately preferred item, and then we just see if they engage in prompt behavior in order to gain attention. So if what ends up happening is if the client engages in prompt behavior to gain attention, we're going to deliver that attention. Okay, so we'll deliver it for a few seconds. And then once that attention is delivered, we withdraw our attention again. And they're just left with, again, the neutral toy or the moderately preferred toy and no attention. And then if the behavior occurs again, we will provide attention. And the attention can look different. It could be like oh, Johnny, you wanted to play with me. I'm sorry. And then you play with them for a few seconds and then you withdraw your attention. Or it could be a form of a reprimand, because we know that there are also behaviors that are maintained by reprimands. So it could be like, what are you doing? Like, why did you do that? You shouldn't do that, to see if it's the reprimand that's maintaining the behavior. And then what we do is every single time that they engage in the prompt behavior, we provide attention for a few seconds. Once the attention, we're done providing attention, we turn around, we withdraw our attention, and so on and so forth. Each instance in which they engage in the behavior, they gain attention. And what we as behavior analysts do, or the person that's conducting the session does, is that we collect data on how often the behavior is occurring within each condition. So within that 10-minute condition, how often did the behavior occur? Or however long the session is. The traditional way is 10 minutes, but you can set up your session in different ways. So I have a video sample for you guys on the next slide. Oh, it's on the following slide. I'm sorry. So here's a treatment integrity checklist that you can use to make sure that you are meeting all of the different criteria for a particular attention condition. So these are some of the things that you would make sure you can check off to ensure that you're conducting the condition appropriately. So the attention condition, you would have to make sure that you are providing a neutral or moderately preferred toy, that the therapist does not provide attention until the target behavior occurs, that immediate attention is provided contingent on the target behavior, that attention is brief and specific to the behavior, and then after you've provided that brief attention, the therapist resumes withholding attention. So you want to make sure all of these things you're able to check them off before you can, well, actually not before, after the session ends, you typically conduct a treatment integrity checklist to make sure that you ran the condition correctly. So now we're going to watch a sample video of a functional analysis. This is just the attention condition. The behavior, unfortunately, the people that published the video did not provide a definition of the target behavior, but it appears to be like some form of screaming. It's not, you'll see it there, but you can see, because it's the specific topography that they end up reinforcing by providing attention. He does like some lower vocalizations, and they don't provide attention for those. So it seems that there's like some specific criteria in terms of voice volume that needs to be met in order for the behavior to be counted and for them to provide the attention. So you'll see in the video what that looks like, and hopefully you'll be able to understand, I guess, what the target behavior is, even though we don't have a clear definition, and then how they're providing attention contingent on the behavior.
Okay. All right, Bella, have a seat in the chair. Okay, I have some reading to do, but you can play with this camera. Bella, you don't have to cry. You can play with this to keep yourself busy. Bella, remember, you can play with this. You don't have to cry. Arr. Arr. Bella, you don't have to scream like that. You don't have to cry. You can play with this over here. Bella, you don't have to cry. You can play with this. Okay.
So anyways, the video carries on in that way. The session, it has a specific duration. So until they don't meet that duration, they won't stop the session. So they'll just continue doing the same thing. He'll withdraw attention once the behavior occurs. He provides attention contingent on the behavior, and then he withdraws attention again. And if you notice in this particular video, the form of attention was just simply saying, you don't have to do that, or no, don't do that. And so this just points like, I guess it helps us to see that attention isn't simply something positive or what we view as positive, right? Something that is a reprimand can function to maintain a behavior. And in this particular case, we can see that the behavior continues to occur. So if we were to see this in a session in an attention condition where the behavior occurs consistently each time that attention is provided, then we can say that attention is likely maintaining that particular behavior. And that can be attention in the form of a reprimand, or maybe some attention in the form of praise, approaching a person, etc. Attention can be, set up in different ways.
Okay. All right, Bella.
Okay, now let's discuss what a demand or an escape condition will look like in a functional analysis. The purpose of an escape or demand condition is to test if a behavior is maintained by escape from demands, or from any particular situation. And so the way that we would set up the environment is to have that EO present. And so we want the participant to be in a controlled setting, typically, well, depending on the type of functional analysis, but for the Iwata one, or the traditional one, which is the one that I'm trying to describe with these different slides. What we do traditionally is we set up the room with very few items except for some demand. And so the participant is presented with some academic demands back to back to back. There's really no breaks in between. And what we do is when the problem behavior occurs contingent on the demand being presented, when the problem behavior occurs, what we do is we provide escape from that demand for 30 seconds contingent on the problem behavior. And then after that 30-second break, we continue to reintroduce the task again. So it could look something like, having a math worksheet, or it can be having people follow simple one-step instructions over and over and over and over. And then each time that they engage in the problem behavior, the demand is immediately removed, and they're allowed to just have a break for those 30 seconds. This is done for the entire duration of the session. And then we tally up how often the behavior occurred within that particular condition. So here is a treatment integrity checklist that you can go through that will let you know if you're conducting the session appropriately. So you should make sure that appropriate tasks are prepared and presented. The tasks are presented continuously without unnecessary breaks. Immediate removal of tasks occur contingent on the target behavior. You provide a break, and that break typically lasts around 30 seconds, but this can vary depending on how you set up your sessions. You just want to make sure it's always the same duration consistently with, however you decide to set up your session. And then tasks are reintroduced promptly after the break. Now let's look at what the demand condition could look like in a functional analysis.
Okay. We are going to do some work. Say mama. Mama. All right, good job. Say mama. Say mama. 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 Excellent. Good job, Isabella. Say mama. Say mama. Mama. Say mama. Mama. Isabella, say mama. Say mama. Say mama. Mama. Okay, you don't have to. Say mama. Say mama. Wow. All right, you don't have to.
Okay, so we'll stop there. So you can see that in this particular video or this condition, what they do is they provide demands back to back. In this particular case, I'm not sure why, but he used the same demand over and over, the same mama. But typically when I've conducted functional analyses and I run the escape condition, I do different demands. I repeat different demands over and over. Or I vary the demands, I'm sorry. I don't repeat the same demand over and over. But you can see that it's very fast paced. There's not really breaks in between the demands. Really what we want to do is try to create a similar situation under which the behavior may occur in a natural condition, where we're basically trying to see, is it demands that's evoking the behavior, or that is preceding behavior? And then if it is it escape that's maintaining behavior? So that's essentially what we're trying to do with the demand condition, and that's what we saw here, where each time that he engages in the behavior, the demand is immediately removed. You say, okay, you don't have to. You turn around and you just let them take a break for those 30 seconds, or you could set it up to be 15 seconds, 20 seconds, however long you want it to be. Okay, so for the tangible condition, we are going to set it up in a very similar way, except in this particular condition, we are testing to see if the behavior is maintained by access to tangibles or activities, etc. And so the way that we set up the environment is to have the preferred items or activities. Again, we're trying to set up an establishing operation for the behavior to occur. And so what we do is we withhold any preferred items from the participant or from the client. And then when they engage in problem behavior, we provide access to the items for 30 seconds. And then as soon as the 30 seconds are over, we withdraw the items again. If they engage in the behavior again, we provide the access to the items, and so on and so forth. We continue doing this throughout the entire duration of the session. And again, we're just tallying how often the behavior occurs throughout that particular session. So here is a treatment integrity checklist that you can use to confirm that you are conducting the tangible condition appropriately. So you want to make sure that preferred items are identified and present in the environment. I don't think I've mentioned this, but prior to conducting any functional analysis, we typically conduct a preference assessment, because it's very important to identify the items that are moderately preferred, low preference items, or neutral items, and we also need to identify items that are preferred items. And so within the tangible condition, we want to include the most preferred items for the participant, because those are the items that are likely to evoke, the participant wants to gain access to. And so if the behavior is maintained by access to tangibles, those are the ones that are most likely for them to engage in the problem behavior because they want to gain access to them. Okay, so let me go back to the treatment integrity checklist. We want to make sure we have preferred items that are identified, and then we want to present those in the environment. The access to the items are going to be restricted at the start of the session, and they should only actually get access to those items contingent on the problem behavior. So immediate access to the items is provided contingent on the problem behavior. The access to the duration is consistent across all sessions. And then items are removed promptly after the access period. And then again, you would do the same thing over and over. Every single time the behavior occurs, you provide access to that tangible, and so on. In this video, you'll see a demonstration of what the tangible condition looks like.
All right. Hey, you play with this a bit. access. My turn.
I'm going to pause really quick just so I can go over what he just said. So he said 1 minute free access. This is something that is done in some variations of functional analyses in which we provide like an initial access to the tangible. It serves as a control where basically the person is given access to the tangible, and therefore we shouldn't see problem behavior. If the behavior is in fact maintained by access to tangibles, then ideally we shouldn't see behavior during that period where they're given access to the tangibles. And then what we're doing is we're removing the access to the tangibles, and we're creating and establishing operation for them to engage in the behavior if the behavior is actually maintained by access to tangibles. Then when the tangibles are removed, you would see the behavior ideally occur or increase during that session. So that's what he's referring to here, and it's something that is done in some variations of functional analyses.
Wow! All right, you can have that. All right, it's my turn. Wow! You can have it back.
Okay, I'll pause right here. The condition will continue throughout the duration of the session in the same way. Each time that he engages in the behavior, he gains access to the reinforcer for the specified duration that was pre-selected. So in this case, they did, I think, 30 seconds, but you can, as I said, set your own specific duration. And then as soon as the time has passed, he takes the item again, and he takes it in an abrupt manner, just as would be done in a natural environment. So if the behavior is actually maintained by access to tangibles in the natural environment, typically, the interruption with the access to that tangible is pretty abrupt. And that's why you'll see during a functional analysis, they just take the item. They don't ask for the item back or wait for the participant or the client to give the item back, but rather they just take it and they say, it's my turn, and they snatch it away. This is because we're trying to see what's the reinforcer that's maintaining this behavior in the natural environment. And we know that in the natural environment, these transitions tend to happen in a very abrupt manner. So we're trying to mimic that same thing in our functional analyses. So an example of this in the natural environment, in a classroom setting, when you're transitioning from a preferred activity to a non-preferred activity, those changes can happen very abruptly. The teacher might say, okay, we're all done playing, put your toys away, we're going now to the cafeteria. And that is a very abrupt transition that will likely evoke problem behaviors for a client that engages in problem behavior for access to tangibles. Or caregivers may not give warnings prior to turning off the TV or removing access to a tangible. And so in the tangible condition of a functional analysis, we're setting it up in the same way as we would see in the natural environment. You give access to tangible contingent on the behavior, and then after the time passes, you remove it very abruptly to see if the behavior will occur again. And then just as we would with any of the other conditions within the traditional functional analysis, we are tracking how often the behavior occurs during that specific session. And so the more it occurs, the more it's more likely to be indicative of that being a function of problem behavior. Okay, now we're going to look at the alone condition, which is a condition in which we are trying to test to see if the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. In this condition, what we do is we set up a participant in a room without toys, without any materials, and there's no social interaction. The researcher can be in the room with the participant for this session. Sometimes they choose to be out of the room. It really depends. But basically they are going to be without interaction. That's the general idea. And then you just simply observe and record the occurrences of the target behavior. If the behavior is in fact maintained by automatic reinforcement, it will occur within this condition. And then you'll also see it occur across other conditions as well. Let's review now a treatment integrity checklist for an alone condition. So you want to make sure that the room is free from toys, materials, and social interaction. You want to make sure that the participant is left alone without interruptions. And like I said, this will vary depending on who's conducting the alone condition. Some people opt to be in the room and just not pay attention to the client at all or the participant at all. And then some people opt to be outside of the room. And then no programmed consequences are provided for any behavior. So if you are in the room or if you're outside of the room, you basically will not be interacting with that client whatsoever, and there should be no consequences for any behavior that they engage in. And then finally, you're going to record instances of the target behavior as they occur. Here is a sample of what that alone condition could look like. And in this particular video, the researcher or the therapist, you could say, is in the room for the alone condition.
Okay. I have some work to do. I'll be right back. This is our one-way mirror.
He says this is our one-way mirror. Like he's pretending that there's that it's an observation room, and he's observing the client or the participant from that room, and that he wouldn't be in the same room as him. That's what he said, that one-way mirror thing. I'm going to pause here, but as I mentioned, in the alone condition, you're trying to see if the behavior occurs in order to understand if the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. So if the behavior was maintained, the behavior of screaming that we saw in the previous videos, or the yelling, or however you want to phrase it, if that behavior were maintained by automatic reinforcement, then we would see it during this condition, and we would also see it across other conditions as well, but we would see it in this condition, and so then we would know that the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. Sorry, I did that by accident. Finally, let's look at the play condition, which it serves as our control condition, meaning that within this condition, we are trying to just rule out all the different sources of reinforcement that a behavior could be occurring for. We want to make sure that we're providing access to tangibles, we're providing attention non-contingently and frequently throughout the session, and that there are no demands placed for the participant. And then basically within the play or control condition, what we should see is no instances of problem behavior as long as the behavior is not maintained by automatic reinforcement. If the behavior is occurring in this session, typically that's indicative of a behavior that's maintained by automatic reinforcement, because a behavior that's automatically maintained will occur indiscriminately across all conditions. You'll see it in all conditions, whether it be the play condition, the alone condition, the tangible condition, escape condition, or the attention condition. You'll see it across all of the conditions because it tends to occur for self-stimulation, there's some purpose that the behavior serves for the individual. They get some reinforcement on their own, and it doesn't depend on any of these environmental contingencies that are in place. And so what we are trying to do, as I mentioned with the play condition, is to account or satiate the need for all of those other sources of reinforcement. So there's no need for escape because there's no demands being placed. You're not going to engage in problem behavior to gain access to tangibles because you have your most preferred items already available to you. And you don't have to engage in problem behavior to gain attention because we're already providing attention to you very consistently throughout the session. And so, as I mentioned, the way that this session is set up is that the participant has free access to highly preferred toys and activities. They get non-contingent attention throughout the session. Non-contingent means that we are providing a specific reinforcer throughout the session, regardless of what the behavior is. It's not contingent on any particular behavior. And in this case, we're providing attention non-contingently, okay? And as I mentioned, there's no demands placed on the participant. We deliver attention at least every 30 seconds, independent of behavior. So whether the problem behavior occurs or does not occur, we are still going to provide attention consistently throughout the session. And then any instances of the behavior, of the problem behavior, the target problem behavior, are going to be ignored. There's not going to be any change in the environment that's produced based off of the occurrence of the behavior. Now, if it's time for you to provide attention and the behavior is occurring, you're still going to provide the attention. If it's time for you to provide attention and the problem behavior is not occurring, you again will still provide attention. That's what we mean by non-contingent attention. It's not dependent on any environmental factor, on any particular behavior occurring. We are simply providing attention on a time-based schedule. Here is that checklist for the play condition that includes all of those requirements that I just mentioned. So they're going to have the highly preferred activity, non-contingent attention, no demands during the session, attention given at least once every 30 seconds, and then the target behavior is going to be ignored without providing any consequences, with the exception of the non-contingent attention if it lines up with when you're supposed to provide attention. So now let's look at what this condition would look like in an FA. So let's take a look.
All right. Here, let's have a seat. Let's play. That's a cool pen you got there. That's a full set of keys. That's a nice trick.
I'll stop it here, but you get the general idea. He has access to his preferred items, he's receiving attention, and then there's no demands placed. And so ideally within this condition, as I mentioned, we wouldn't observe the problem behavior occur unless the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement as well. And in that case, we would see the behavior occur consistently across all sessions. Sorry. So now that we've gone over over each of those different conditions and what they would look like, let's look at some graphs and learn about interpreting FA results. So the way that you interpret FA results is going to be different based off of the different types of functional analyses that you conduct. So as I mentioned, in some of them, we're going to look at the duration that it takes for the behavior to happen from the beginning of the session to when the behavior finally occurs. And then in others, we're going to look at how often a behavior occurs in the session. So as we go through this presentation, I'll point out the different types to you. But you don't need to worry about the different types for right now, in terms of how to conduct them or anything like that. But rather, I think it's important for you to look at the graphs and be able to decipher what exactly you're looking at and what the function is. It's very simple. As I mentioned, within behavior analysis, we use visual analysis to determine whether an intervention is effective or not. So I'll go over what this looks like. So in this particular example, we are looking at a graph where in the functional analysis, they conducted all of the different conditions. They have the play condition, the demand condition, the tangible condition, and the attention condition. They did not test for, they didn't have the alone condition, which in this case is okay because we can also use the play condition to help us determine whether the behavior is automatically maintained or not. So here we have the percent of intervals with challenging behavior. So basically, they're tracking, rather than tracking the frequency of the behavior for this particular functional analysis, they looked at the entire session and they split the session into different intervals. So let's say it was a 10-minute session and they broke up the intervals into 1 minute. They have 10 intervals of 1 minute each. And they just tracked how often the behavior occurred in those particular intervals, or within which of those intervals the behavior actually occurred. And that's how they get the percentage of intervals with challenging behavior. But the important thing here is that we want to see visually which condition produced the highest behavior, right? Which one produces the behavior across the most amount of intervals. And in this case, we can clearly see that in the tangible condition, the behavior never occurred. In the play or our control condition, the behavior never occurred, which is a good indication that the behavior is not maintained by automatic reinforcement. However, we do see behavior in about 60 to 80% of our sessions for the attention condition. Okay, so for the attention condition in the first session, the behavior occurred in 60% of the intervals. In the second session for the attention condition, the behavior occurred in around 80% of the intervals, and again, we saw the same results for the third condition. So what this tells us is that attention is definitely one of the reinforcers that's maintaining this particular behavior. And then we also see that during the demand condition, the behavior was occurring. And so this tells us that there's not just one function for the particular problem behavior here. This problem behavior serves two functions: to escape from demands, and it also serves to gain access to attention. So this behavior is we say that this behavior is multiply controlled, or that there are two functions of problem behavior. And you just simply say this behavior occurs for access to attention and escape from demands. And actually, before I finish, let me just emphasize the reason that I know that escape from demands is a controlling variable here is because look at the separation between the demand condition and the other conditions, right? There's a clear distinction. We could see that the behavior occurs consistently. That's the key here, consistently in all of the demand sessions, and the behavior occurs consistently in all of the attention sessions. And there's a differentiation between that data path. These are called data paths here. You'll learn about that. You're going to have a course on graphing, but these are called data paths. The data path for the attention condition and the one for the demand condition have clear differentiation between the other two data paths, the one for play and the one for tangible. Okay, so that's how we know attention and escape from demands are maintaining this particular behavior. They're the reinforcers maintaining this behavior. So now let's look again at this particular graph. this graph in which we have prompt behavior per minute. So they looked at the rate of the behavior. And if we see at the beginning, the behavior wasn't occurring in any of the sessions except for, this is the triangle here, the open triangles, which open triangles are for the demand condition. So we see that initially the behavior was occurring only in the demand conditions. But sometimes as a researcher or as a behavior analyst, we choose to carry out our functional analyses if we don't feel like the results are representative of what's actually happening. So sometimes when we conduct a functional analysis, we have to continue to conduct the sessions in order for for us to get a clear picture of what's actually going on. So what they did was they continued the sessions, right? They continued to conduct sessions. And then what we started to notice was around this time, around session, 13 more or less, we started to see some differentiation in the data with an additional data path. So we started to see that in the tangible condition, the behavior also started to occur. And it occurred consistently after that. So it's not that there was one data point or one session with tangible where it occurred and then the behavior went back down to 0. That's not the case. What happened was that the behavior started occurring in the tangible session and then continued to occur in the tangible session. And this tells us that the behavior is controlled both by tangible. I also didn't mention, I know it's tangible because it's a little square, and here it's telling me that the squares are representative of the tangible condition. So now, because I see this clear differentiation between these two data paths and the other data paths, I can confidently say that this behavior is maintained by access to tangibles and by escape from demands. And I know it's not maintained by the attention or by automatic reinforcement because I can see that in all the other conditions, down here, the behavior never occurs. So again, this behavior is multiply controlled. Now let's look at this functional analysis. This functional analysis in which we are looking at the responses per minute of self-injurious behavior. SIB is an acronym that we use for self-injurious behavior in this field, and it's used in some different fields as well. What we see is that at the beginning, when they first got started with the functional analyses, the behavior was actually occurring across all of the different conditions. But as I mentioned, the behavior was occurring across all of the different conditions, but it was primarily occurring in the attention condition. That's where it occurred most often. So as I mentioned, sometimes when we start with the functional analysis, we need to continue to carry out the functional analysis for a few more sessions so that we can see more clear differentiation in the data. This is a very controlled environment that the participants or our clients are not accustomed to, and so it sometimes takes a period for them to learn what is happening in each condition or to differentiate between each condition. Basically, within each functional analysis condition, we have to set up some SDs to signal to that client or that participant what exactly they can expect in that condition. Otherwise, it can be very difficult for them to differentiate between what's going on. And so that's why we see that these different data paths drop, and then we see that it continues to occur consistently across the attention condition. Therefore, we can confidently say here, well, actually, I want you guys to write down what is the function of this behavior. I'll give you a second, and then I'll tell you guys. Okay, so therefore, we can confidently say here that the function of this behavior is attention, access to attention. Okay, and we know because of the consistent differentiation across this one data path for attention and the other data paths. And also because these end up all going down to 0. So that gives us a clear indication that this is really the function of the behavior. Here, the client was just learning to differentiate between the different conditions. That's most likely what was happening. Next, this functional analysis graph is slightly different. In this particular graph, we are looking at a brief functional analysis. So they don't have data paths. You don't see multiple you don't see the multiple connecting sessions, right? Instead, we are just conducting one session of each particular condition, and we are adding phase change lines to our graphs to separate each condition. So you're only conducting each condition once, and then we're just trying to see, well, how often the behavior occurred in each of those conditions. And we can see here that in the tangible condition, the behavior occurred at a very low rate. I didn't mention this, but we're looking at responses per minute. So the challenging behavior occurred at a very low rate in the tangible condition, at a very low rate in the play condition, which is a good indication that the behavior is not maintained by attention. It occurred at a very low rate in the escape condition. It occurred at a very low rate at a very high rate in the attention condition, and then at a very low rate in the ignore condition. And the ignore condition and the alone condition are very similar. So seeing this data, what do you guys think the function of the behavior is? Please take a moment to respond. Okay. I'll go ahead and review. So in this particular graph, the function of the behavior is the attention condition. And it's because we see that the behavior remains low or does not occur at all in these different conditions. And then it occurs at a much higher rate in the attention condition. And like I mentioned, this is a variation of a traditional functional analysis. It's called the brief FA. And it's one that we can conduct in less time. That way we can identify the function of behavior more quickly and be able to intervene on the problem behavior. This graph is very similar to the one that we just went over in the previous slide. So I would like you guys to take the opportunity to tell me what the function of the behavior in this particular graph is. Okay, and I also want you to try to explain, why is this the function of the behavior? Why are you saying that this is a function of behavior? What in this graph indicates that this is the function? Okay, so I'll go over the results. In this particular graph, the function of the behavior is escape. And the reason is because, again, the behavior is occurring at a higher rate in the escape condition. We see that it's not occurring at all in the play condition or in any of the other conditions, which indicates to us that the behavior is maintained by escape from demands. And this one is one that we haven't seen yet, but I want you to take the opportunity to try to tell me what the function of this behavior is. Based off of everything that we've discussed so far in this lecture, what do you think the function of this behavior is? So in this particular example, this behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. And we know that it's maintained by automatic reinforcement because, as I've mentioned throughout this presentation, when we have a behavior that's automatically maintained, we will see the behavior occur indiscriminately across all conditions. So we see that the behavior is occurring in the ignore condition. We see that the behavior is occurring in the attention condition. It's occurring in the play condition, where remember that the play condition is a control condition. And so they have ideally all of their different potential reinforcers accounted for, right? They have access to their preferred tangibles. They're given attention and they don't have demands being placed. So if we're seeing the behavior occur in this particular condition, that's a very telling. That's very telling. It usually tells us or indicates to us that the behavior is automatically maintained. Another thing that we typically look for is to see if the behavior is occurring consistently across all conditions, which in this case it is. So we see the behavior again occur in the tangible condition and the escape condition. Now let's review. So answer this question for me. Within an attention condition of an FA, what is withheld and only provided contingent on the behavior? So in the attention condition, what exactly is withheld? Please go ahead and respond. Next, please answer this question. What is the purpose of the play condition condition in an FA? Is it to test whether the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement? Is it to establish a baseline comparison for behavior across test conditions? Is it to assess whether problem behavior is maintained by escape from demands? Or is it to determine if the behavior is maintained by access to tangibles? This might be a little bit confusing, this question, but I think it's a good question to ask. Try to remember what I mentioned to you about this particular condition and what we are trying to account for. I also mentioned the behavior may occur in this session, and it could be an indication that the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement, but that's not necessarily the purpose of the condition. So please try to answer this question with that in mind. Okay, so the answer here is to establish a baseline comparison for behavior across test conditions. Okay, we're not necessarily testing to see if the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. We're simply trying to account for all of the different possible reinforcers of the behavior to establish that baseline comparison to see if we can control for the behavior in this particular condition, and then in the test conditions, which include that escape condition, the attention condition, the tangible condition, etc., we would want to ideally see the behavior occur in the particular condition that's maintaining the behavior. The next question says, if a functional analysis shows that the behavior is occurring inconsistently across all the different test and control conditions, what is likely the function of the behavior? Now let's review what the advantages and limitations of FAs are. As I mentioned before, the FA is our gold standard for identification of the function. It gives us a very precise answer to what the function of the behavior is, and it helps us to identify those interventions that are likely to be effective, and interventions that are function-based, that are based off, that will work to mitigate the specific function of the behavior. Okay, and it also allows us to identify causal relations. So we are going to be making decisions on our intervention based off of an actual cause and effect relationship, and not just a correlational relationship that we identified during a descriptive assessment. So our intervention is going to be like driven by data and not just observation. Some misconceptions about functional analyses is that functional analyses are very complex, which, as you saw, they can be complex, but they're really not. Once you learn how to conduct a functional analysis, you'll see that it really helps your reduce the amount of time that it takes to identify effective treatment. They really aren't complex. It's a matter of learning the functional analyses, the different functional analyses, and picking the one that's most likely to fit your client and their needs. And then people also say that they take a very long time. And I would argue that this can be true, but really it isn't. A functional analysis, depending on the type of functional analysis you conduct, can be as brief as a few minutes, or it can be as long as 8 hours. But really, sometimes when we conduct observations for a descriptive assessment and we're collecting ABC data, we have to go out and observe the behavior for many hours in order to get an idea for what the function of the behavior could possibly be, right? To establish a hypothesis of what the function could possibly be. And then we don't actually know the function of the behavior. So if we were to stop at the point of a descriptive assessment, we would be potentially intervening on the behavior without truly knowing the function. And so the perceived time requirement being a limitation of a functional analysis is not necessarily true, and that by conducting a functional analysis and pinpointing exactly what the function of the behavior is, you're now able to cut down on time that you're spending on intervention, because you now know exactly. You're able to basically narrow down the interventions that are likely to be effective, rather than having to go through that trial and error process of not conducting an FA, simply conducting a descriptive assessment, saying, I think the function is for attention and I'm going to implement this intervention, and then finding out, well, that intervention wasn't effective and maybe the function is not actually attention. Let me go back and conduct another FBA. And then you wasted all this time, you wasted all these resources, where in reality you could have just gone the extra step in your FBA, conducted the functional analysis, identified the function, and really pinpointed what intervention is likely to be effective. So although, yes, the functional analysis up front might take a little bit more time or might take a little bit more effort, I would argue that it saves you time in the long run. The FA does come with some constraints. I won't say that it doesn't. One of those constraints is that it does require you to have additional people to support you with conducting the FA. So typically you have 2 people conducting an FA. You have a person that is participating in the session with the participant and delivering the different contingencies, and then you usually also have someone else that's collecting data, outside or collecting treatment and integrity data or IOA data. The other constraints, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a constraint, because there are different, as I mentioned, there are different variations of functional analyses that account for the severity of problem behavior. We have, as I mentioned, the precursor FA or the latency FA that we can conduct for behaviors that are more severe, so that we're minimizing the exposure of a participant or a client to engage in problem behavior. And then the other problem is sometimes we don't have a very controlled environment to conduct an FA. And so that could be an environmental constraint when conducting an FA. And then finally is that the FAs can be resource intensive, as I mentioned, upfront, because you might require more time and more support to be able to, from individuals, to be able to conduct the functional analysis. But I think the long-term benefits outweigh those short-term constraints. So I want you to name at least one advantage of FAs for this slide. On this slide, we are going to review what you could do, or some suggestions that you could implement when you are designing a functional analysis. So definitely, as I've mentioned, you want to conduct a risk assessment. You want to determine the severity of the problem behavior. Think about which variation of a functional analysis would be best to expose your client to, and which one would minimize the risk for that particular client. You'll learn. You don't know about the different variations of the functional analyses in detail right now, and that's okay. You'll learn about it either in an upcoming course or in grad school. But you want to make sure that you are selecting the appropriate functional analysis. You also want to document any potential risks. Maybe you want to have some stop criteria. You want to obtain informed consent from your stakeholders. So before conducting any functional assessment, whether it be an FBA or a functional analysis, you always want to have consent from the different stakeholders for conducting these particular assessments. And then you also want to modify any procedures in order to minimize risks for severe behaviors. A lot of the things on this slide I've already discussed. I just want to go over them one more time. So when you conduct sessions for a functional analysis, you're typically going to have a therapist and an observer. You will have to make sure you're collecting data with a reliable tool, whether it be an app. There's a specific app called County that's used very often for functional analyses, or you can collect data on regular paper and pencil. The important factor is to have a reliable way to collect data, whatever it is, and make sure that your observers or whoever is assisting you with the functional analysis is trained on how to collect data and specifically on what the target behavior is. We've mentioned in the past the importance of having a really good quality definition of problem behavior or of a target behavior. You don't want to be in a functional analysis and be questioning whether that instance of a behavior counted or did not count as problem behavior. You don't want to have any questions, right? You want to be able to implement that contingency, deliver that reinforcer so that you can see the effect that that produces on the behavior. And then, as I mentioned, you're going to use visual inspection. We reviewed what that looks like in this lecture. Some other suggestions for implementing functional analyses would be to try to build your confidence with conducting functional analyses. As I mentioned, they're a little bit more complex. They're not, I wouldn't say they're overly complex, but they are a particular skill for behavior analysts that you have to practice. And I think the best way to practice is by starting with a case where you already have a potential function of problem behavior that you suspect. And so it makes it, and also a behavior that's not very severe. And so it makes it easier, I think, for you to conduct a session to see the effects of the reinforcers on the behavior, and for you to really get a general sense for the function of the behavior. Avoid overly complex cases initially to build confidence and skill in FA methodology. But once you've conducted multiple FAs, you're going to become more skilled in it. You could also seek guidance from your supervisors or from other people in the field that are skilled with conducting functional analysis in order to help you build that particular skill set. Some other considerations are staff training. So you only want to implement FAs that require consistency in interactions. You want to train methods. You want to have specific training methods, including video modeling of correct procedures. You can practice role playing what a functional analysis might look like, just as in those videos that I showed you. You can practice in that same exact way with a fellow therapist in order to learn how to conduct those sessions and to really make sure, that you are meeting all of those different items in the different treatment integrity checklists that I provided or whatever treatment integrity checklist you've created. And then you want to go through that feedback, go through those treatment integrity checklists, see what you missed, provide feedback, and then continue to improve on your skills or your therapist skills. So in conclusion, FBAs are very critical tools for understanding and addressing problem behavior. It involves different methodologies, as I mentioned, right? It has the indirect assessment method. It has the descriptive assessment method, and then it has the functional analysis assessment method. And the functional analyses, or the FAs, are going to be the gold standard for identifying our behavioral functions. I mentioned all the different reasons why you would conduct one over another and which one would lead to the most ideal identification of function. And then how we can take these results from the functional analyses or from the FBA and turn that into a function-based intervention. In upcoming courses, as I mentioned, you're going to learn a lot more about FA methodologies and how to pick the different assessments and whatnot. We covered them briefly here, but you'll learn a lot more about them in other courses.